You have been betrayed. The best years of your life have been stolen from you. You have been treated like property. And now here you are, standing before the very people who inflicted all of that on you, and you have all the power. What would you do? So there's a tension in any conversation about spiritual formation and discipleship. The further up you go, the more personal your journey becomes. After all, God is working through your life, your story, your circumstances, your relationships, your context, your interests and passions, the highs and lows of your life. God is doing something unique in your story for his kingdom. But not only that, the further in we go, the further into the life of the Trinity, the more mysterious this journey becomes. We are being transformed, but it's often happening slowly, over time, from the inside out, in ways that we just can't fully understand and appreciate even in the moment. And so instead of just describing stage 5 to you today or giving you 3 simple steps so that you can go out here and become a stage 5 disciple by the end of the week, what I want to do instead is actually just hold up some portraits of people from Scripture that I think really embody life with God at this stage. And the idea here is not just to read their stories so we can go out and do what they did. Again, their life is not your life, their story is not your story. It is instead to gaze at these portraits so we can learn to see how they see, to think how they think, so that we can gain wisdom for our own life with God. So you ready? You ready? Okay, here we go. Portrait number 1 is Joseph. We're introduced to him in Genesis. His story is like 13 chapters long, so we don't have anything like the time to unpack it in detail, but fortunately it's a pretty familiar story to a lot of us, and if not, here are the highlights. So when we are introduced to Joseph in Genesis 37, the first thing we're told about him is that he's a tattletale. It's like the worst person, right? Like, oh, is there anything worse than a tattletale? His early portrait is of an immature teen with delusions of grandeur. He is the 11th of 12 sons belonging to Jacob, who we talked about a couple of weeks ago. And something else you should know is that he's actually Jacob's favorite son, despite his birth order. And this has gone to his head in some ways. He regularly seems to have dreams in which he is ruling over his family and his brothers are all bowing down to him. And he has no problem bringing this up at dinner. He's just dumb. He's terrible, immature person. But one day, Joseph the Tattler, Joseph the dreamer, is sent out to meet with his brothers who are far off tending their flocks away from home. And as the opportunity presents itself, as so often, the family tension just finally boils over. Brothers have had enough. They seize him, they fake his death, and they sell him into slavery. And Joseph, the favored son of Jacob, becomes Joseph, the property of a man named Potiphar. Against all the odds, though, Joseph gains the favor and respect of Potiphar and makes his way up in his household, only once again to be betrayed, this time by Potiphar's wife. And this lands Joseph in prison. But it's while he's in prison that he meets one of his cellmates, who is a cupbearer of Pharaoh. And this cupbearer is having a dream that he can't quite understand, and so Joseph, he gives him help with that. And this conversation becomes the catalyst for Joseph to eventually find himself standing before Pharaoh, king of Egypt, helping him understand and interpret a confusing dream. And when Joseph has this opportunity, he looks Pharaoh in the eyes and he says, this dream you're having, it's pretty easy actually. It's a message from God. The next 7 years for you are going to be awesome. The land is going to produce, everything is going to go great. But then 7 years after that, is going to be a great famine in the land. And then Joseph's wisdom and counsel helps Pharaoh figure out what to do with this dream that he's had. And Pharaoh says this to him: "Could we find a man like him, in whom is the Spirit of God? After God has made known to you all this, there is none as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and by your lips all my people shall be guided. By the throne alone shall I be greater than you. See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." So for the next 7 years, Joseph helps Egypt prepare for the coming famine. And eventually that famine comes. And it is a great famine. And it spreads not only throughout Egypt, but throughout all of the region, including Canaan, where Jacob's family dwells. And in utter desperation, Jacob sends all of his sons down to Egypt to get grain so that they won't die. And this is the occasion that brings Joseph face to face with his brothers for the first time in over a decade. Before we go on, let me just ask you the question. Imagine you're Joseph. You have been betrayed. The best years of your life have been stolen from you. You have been treated like property. And now here you are, standing before the very people who inflicted all of that on you, and you have all the power. What would you do? How would you respond to this situation? Genesis 45, we're told Joseph could no longer hold himself in check before all who stood attendance upon him, and he cried, "Clear out, everyone around me." And no one stood with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And as he wept aloud, and the Egyptians heard, and the house of Pharaoh heard, and Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed before him. And Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me, pray." And they came close, and he said, "I am Joseph, your brother, who you sold into Egypt. And now do not be pained, and do not be incensed with yourselves that you sold me down here, because for sustenance God has sent me before you. 2 years now there have been famine in the heart of the land, and there are yet 5 years without plowing and harvesting. And God has sent me before you to make a remnant on earth and to preserve life, for you to be a great surviving group. And so it is not you who sent me here, but God. And he made me father to Pharaoh and lord to all of his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord over all of Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay, and you shall dwell in the land of Goshen and shall be close to me. You and your sons and the sons of your sons and your flocks and your cattle and all that is yours, and I will sustain you there. For yet 5 years of famine remain, lest you lose all, you and your household and all that is yours.'" And that's exactly what happens. Joseph's brothers go and get Jacob. They bring him down. There's a big family reunion. It's an amazing moment. It's an amazing story. And it all kind of seems too good to be true, doesn't it? This is exactly what Joseph's brothers think. In Genesis chapter 50, we pick up the story. And Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead. Jacob finally dies. And they said, "If Joseph bears resentment against us, he will surely pay us back for all the evil we caused him. He may have treated us kindly while Dad was alive, but now that Dad's gone, we're going to see Joseph as he really is. We're going to see what's really in there." And they charged Joseph, saying, "Your father left a charge before his death." Hey, we talked to Dad. You weren't there. You didn't hear this conversation. But Dad told us this. "Thus you shall say to Joseph, we beseech you, forgive the crime and the offense of your brothers, for evil they have caused you. Forgive the crime of the servants of your father's God." And Joseph hears this, and he wept when they spoke to him. And his brothers came, and they flung themselves before him, and in a great irony they said, "Here we are, your slaves. We sold you into slavery, now we want to be your slaves." Is that the best we can do here? And then Joseph looks at them and he says this, "Fear not, for am I instead of God? While you meant evil towards me," there's no doubt about it, "God meant it for good, so as to bring it about at this very time, keeping many people alive. And so fear not. I will sustain you and your little ones." And he comforted them, and he spoke to their hearts. Joseph the tattletale has become Joseph the rescuing ally. The teen who used to dream of ruling over his family now sees himself as a servant and as a sustainer, not just for his family, but for everybody. It's amazing. Joseph, you see, He didn't end up telling the story that he would have written from himself at the beginning. Not even close. And yet, in the end, he is somehow able to see that it was through all of his adversity that God transformed him into the kind of person who can play a big role in God's story. You could become that kind of a person. You could become that kind of a person. God has that in mind for you. Don't ever underestimate how much your life can be changed the longer you experience it with God. The longer you keep saying yes to Jesus. The longer you keep letting the Spirit of God work in and through your life. Further up, further in, one day at a time, for a lifetime. That's the invitation.